Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to play with something that is completely new to me, and that is attempting a fractal gradient on yarn. Fractal patterns get smaller and smaller with each repeat, and this is something that spinners like to play with a lot in a really fun way. I'm not sure if the main colorway that we are going to create today technically counts as fractal because I don't know if it's going to actually repeat, but we are going to create a gradient with connected mini skeins, but the mini skeins are going to be different sizes. One is going to be a lot bigger and then the other ones will be much smaller. And we'll go through the whole process from how I wind out the minis to measuring out the amount of dye for each one, and then we will actually look at the actual dyeing. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to all of the ChemKnits patrons. If you'd like to learn more about the ChemKnits Patreon and how you can get early access to videos like this, you can find a link to it down in the video description. And I also wanted to give a quick example of what I'm talking about in terms of a fractal colorway before we get on to the main project. Right here I have a sock blank that is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. It's a double-stranded sock blank, so when we unravel it, we will have two matched 50-gram balls of yarn. I did pre-soak it with some vinegar, and I'm going to use two colors of the Wilton Color Mist food coloring spray to create a fractal repeating pattern on here. The stripes at one side are much thicker, and then with each repeat they get thinner and thinner and thinner. I actually used some toothpicks to help me plan out where I wanted these stripes to be located before we proceeded with the spraying. Even though my original plan was 2 stripes, I decided to go with 3 so that way the stripes that were the biggest could actually be a tiny bit smaller. And I really like how the pattern came together as just a way to visualize the way that these repeats get smaller and smaller and smaller. My green color mist spray actually was nearly empty, so I mixed up a green in a little spray pen using 2 drops of color white yellow and 1 drop of blue, and I did this twice. So a total of 6 drops total for all the green that I put on this blank. There will be a video coming up featuring various spray utensils on blanks, so stay tuned for that, and I will be talking about that a lot more in another video. Oh my goodness, this took a little bit longer than I thought, especially when one of my Color Mist spray bottles sort of tapped out. But you can see that I have about half, approximately, of the blank in one section, then about a quarter, even smaller and smaller and smaller, all the way down. So if you were going to use this, say, in a triangle shawl or something that started small at the beginning and then got bigger and bigger as you went out, the number of rows that you get each color might actually be a little more similar versus if you did a self-striping yarn with equal sized stripes of each color. Then when you go and you did something where you start small at the top and you get bigger and bigger and bigger, in that kind of case, then you might see the stripes get smaller and smaller and smaller as you go towards the outside. So that's one reason why someone might like something like this. Plus, it's just kind of fun. Imagine starting at the toes here and working your way up for some matched socks. Now, this particular blank is not going to give us perfect stripes or sections because of the way it's knit. There will be some variegated rows in between. And I do have a video where I did a quote self-striping blank that you can look at to get a sense of how something like this might knit up. But because we sprayed, we will actually have little speckles for each of these colors, adding another element of fun to this particular yarn. My goal today, as I wipe up these edges, is much more of a gradient versus a striping pattern, which is why I'm not entirely sure if what we'll be creating could be technically called a fractal gradient because it doesn't repeat, but the color sections get smaller and smaller. So if there's a better term for this type of gradient, please let me know. But I have shown an actual fractal pattern here. I happen to have my steamer basket set up, so we will be going to steam set this, but in general I would be totally comfortable, since this is food coloring, microwaving this as long as all of the tools and equipment I used were dedicated for dyeing yarn and not also used for food. But we are going to roll this up, and you can already see how much less pigment we have on the other side. There is definitely some. I went a little heavy, so we might see a little less speckling. But I'm going to go steam set this for 30 minutes on my stovetop. Let's wash our hand-painted fractal repeating pattern. This is going to feel a little bit different to the gradients that I'm going to be dyeing later in this video, mainly because this is a pattern that repeats, and the gradients we're dyeing will probably feel like a softer shift of color versus having a harsh demarcation in between each color change. I am not planning to unravel this blank, mainly because I think that seeing it helps you visualize how it could work up into another pattern. But I do always offer customers to unravel blanks for them. I added a little bit of clear dish soap to the wash. There was no bleeding, so I rinsed out the soap, put the blank through my spin dryer, and hung it up to dry. For our gradient, we are going to divide our 100-gram skein into some connected mini skeins. And first we will be winding that gradient into a yarn cake, weighing it, and then we will weigh it to know when we've hit the various stopping points. Now, this is my plan for the first 100-gram skein we're going to look at. We are going to divide it into, the first mini skein will be 50, then 25, 12 and a half, 6, 3, going down. So each section will be half the size of the previous one. Now, with this smallest section right here, I'm actually going to start sectioning that one first. So this 50 grams might be more like 53, but I think it'll help the balance of everything to start small and work our way up. Another way we could do this would be if we did 3/4 of the size of our stripe each time. So if we started with 33 grams, then we'd have 25, 18, 14, and 10. This isn't drawn to scale or anything, this is less extreme than the size changes that we saw over here. And we might try it both ways. I think it'll be hard to see anything visually since I won't be knitting up the entire gradients at the end. But I will have each of the gradients wound sort of flat onto a nitty knotty so that at the end, so that way we can sort of get a little bit of a visual look. And if you're curious how I arrived at these numbers, I set up a spreadsheet, decided I wanted each stripe to be 3/4 of the size of the previous one, and then sort of finagled with it from there until I got numbers that worked. But again, I would start at the smallest mini and then work my way up, because that makes, I guess, more of a difference. If I ended up with a lot of extra for the last one, that could throw the whole thing off. For the yarn today, we are going to be using Knit Picks Superwash Merino Twist. This is the Bare Twill base. It is a heavy worsted weight yarn, and I'll admit I picked it in part because of the yardage. There are only 150 yards per 100 grams, and since I will be winding everything multiple times throughout this video, that'll make it a little easier for me to section things off and use this as a proof of concept before I commit to doing this on fingering or lace weight yarn. But if I like how it turns out, then I can tweak going forward to decide how big these sections could be. And who knows, maybe in the future we will try this with more sections so we can actually get a repeating like 2-color stripe. So instead of doing 5 sections, we have 10 sections, but then we would still be able to fit everything all in one pot. So, proof of concept, and then in the future we will go in this in a bigger way. I made my center pull yarn cakes, and now we will weigh them and start wrapping. Our first ball actually weighs 106 grams. This is my homemade warping board that has made an appearance in some other videos. It is, each of the banisters that it's constructed with are 3 feet long. And so we will be using these different pegs to wind our minis on just because it is convenient and I have it. But you could wind your minis around the back of a chair. You could use a PVC pipe nitty knotty like I've done in some other videos. So you have many options. I just thought it would be fun to pull this out again. So the ball of yarn is 106.3 grams to start with. And for this gradient, we are going to be starting with our smallest mini skein. So I'm just going to tie a little slip knot up here and then wrap the yarn around. And this, it's about 150 yards per 100 grams. So probably 1 gram will be about 1.5 yards. So it won't take long to hit our approximately 3.125 grams. And all right, we're gonna go ahead and call it 2 full wraps for this first one. And that brings us to, okay, so we have 101.8 grams left, which is, actually it's closer to about 5 grams. But what I want to do on this one is, we know that was 2. So let's go ahead and do 1, 2, 3, 4. It's going to be a little hard to say weight-wise. I probably should have had it end at the bottom versus the top, because I can't weigh this 1 yard for the next one, but we are at about 96.0 grams. But we have double, so this was 2 wraps, this was 4 wraps. And so let's go ahead and over here, we are going to do 8 wraps. So 1, so that was 8 wraps. And now let's see where we weigh compared to the last one. And we are at 83, and I'm writing all these down, 1 grams. And that is about 13 grams. That difference is, so we are on target with the numbers. I think the first one just might be a tiny bit off. So I am going to continue this. And I think I may as well count wraps and just see how close we end up with that counting method, because that could be a easier way to do it versus using the scale, but I will also weigh everything. While I finish wrapping up the rest of this yarn, I would like to take this opportunity to give a huge shout out and thank you to the patrons, Jessica Parco, Claire, Karen Siegel, and the rest of the Fiber patrons. You'll see some of their names crossing the screen right now. Patreon is a great platform that connects fans with content creators they really enjoy, and there's a lot of really cool perks, some behind the scenes content, early access to some videos, and things like that. And so you should really go and check out the Patreon. Links are down in the video description. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting my color adventures. All right, so in total, we've got 2, 4, 8, 20, and then 40 wraps. I think that as we got to our thicker minis, as I was wrapping it, it was a little tighter than in some of these loose ones. So the grams per wrap probably went down. But ultimately, if the actual physical weights don't quite match up with our plan, where each one has half the amount as the other one, at least the wraps do match up, because ultimately the length is what is important to us here. When I zoom in, you can really see the difference in the thickness of each of these minis. And it really, really is heavy on that biggest one over on the far right. So we are gonna have to be a little creative as we work through this and think about our colorways. But I will be using our target weights to help us design the amount of dye that we need on each of these, so that way we can have a gradient that we do see visually. Now we are going to do some math to calculate the amount of dye that we need in each of these circumstances. And I'm going to bring along my computer so that way you can watch me talk through these calculations a little bit. So one thing that was really interesting is that if we consider the total number of wraps that we had in each of these mini skeins, it all adds up to being 74. And given that there were 150, I think, yards per 100 grams, each of my wraps was 2 yards, this worked out pretty well. So that's sort of a nice little check. Now, the weights that we were going for don't actually match up with the actual weights. But I think that I want to do our dye calculations based on the predicted weight. I'll show you for the actual, but the predicted weight is going to give a really, really cool result that'll be really, really fun, I think, to show you, and will make this a doubly fun exercise. So I did right here, these are just the weights when I weighed the yarn cake in between each one, but I think the smallest one might be slightly off compared to the rest. But we matched up pretty well. Okay, so let's say that we want the darkest color to be on our smallest mini skein. So the bulk is going to be pretty light, and we're going to have like just a hint and a pop of darkness in our yarn. So I want a 2% depth of shade on the smallest section and a 0.125% depth of shade on the largest. What is depth of shade? Depth of shade is defined as 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. So if we wanted a 1% depth of shade and we had 6 grams of yarn, or 6.125 grams of yarn, the number of grams of dye we would need would be equal to our depth of shade times the number of grams of yarn we had divided by 100. And that is 0.06, actually 0.0625 grams of dye. Now, and just to show, if this were actually 100 grams of yarn, then we would need 1 gram of dye, which is based on how it works. So if you're setting up a spreadsheet, it's always worth to double check with numbers that you know would work. So if this was 50, we would need half a gram of dye, and that is what we know, and ignore the other number changing. So let's do this calculation again. And you might be able to see where this is going. If we want a 2% depth of shade, we would take that, we would multiply it by the number of grams that we have, divided by 100, and what do you know? It is the exact same amount. And if we take this and copy it up, you can see that we need the exact same amount of dye in each of these mini skein samples. And this is why I thought it would be fun to use the actual weight, because you can see how the same amount of dye on different amounts of yarn really makes a difference. And so these calculations, and it's really just because the relationship of the dye that I picked and then the yarn that we picked, because we want the darkest color on the smallest section and the lightest color on the other section. If we were to flip all of these numbers, so if we had 50, 25, 12.5, 6.25, and then 3.125, if we were to flip the numbers upside down, the number of grams the number of grams of dye that we need for each of them changes. This relationship really just works because of that inverse relationship we have. And so therefore, the calculation for the number of milliliters that we need is pretty easy. A 1% stock solution is 1 gram of dye in 100 milliliters of yarn. So if we need 0.06 grams, we take that and we're just going to multiply it by 100. And so we'll need 6.25 milliliters of dye. So in just this specific case, or something like it where we want this relationship, it doesn't necessarily matter if I measure out 7 grams of dye for each of them, or if I measure out 10 grams of dye. The relationship will be the same because we're going to add the same amount of dye to each container. Now, I might make things a little more complicated and make a dye stock that we partition out so that way I can actually keep that dye consistent, but I haven't actually decided if I'm going to do that, and I've been talking about the math for a while. I wanted to quickly go through and show what these numbers would look like if we use the actual weight of the dye that we used. And you can see there's a tiny bit more variation in here, ranging from, I guess, 5.8 milliliters to 9 milliliters of dye that we need. And so really I could go and focus on those numbers, but instead I think that adding the exact same amount to each of the jars would be pretty fun. I really hope that the math I just did was not too confusing. If this is something that you guys would be interested for me to go more in depth again and show the calculations more long form and really bring like the percents, make those the fractions divided by 100 so you can see how all the 100s cancel out. Part of this I know works because I have played with these numbers a lot, and then double checking the 1% depth of shade and checking the math there is an area that I'm comfortable with. And this, I know all these numbers make sense based on the calculations I've done in the past, but I also know that this could be pretty confusing, and so I'm not sure how well this like screen record thing worked. In theory, I could have recorded this like straight on, but yeah, there's spoilers over there that I couldn't really show. I came back to the computer because I think I do want to make up a stock so that way I can measure out a volume that'll be a little easier to be consistent. And so we're actually going to make a 0.25% stock solution. Basically, we're just going to be diluting our dye stock so that way I can measure out a bigger volume of water. To make this 0.25% stock solution, I'll take 100 milliliters of our 1% stock plus 300 milliliters of water. And that is how I will make that stock solution. But, and then by doing this, this means that I can take 4 times the amount of dye for each of our samples. And so that whoops. And so it's a lot easier to measure out 25 milliliters of dye than it is to measure out 6.25 milliliters accurately. And so that's one reason why I will be diluting the stock first, and this will allow more consistency in the amount of dye across the samples. And especially since we'll be adding more water to them anyway, the dilution doesn't really have a negative impact. And so I only need 125 milliliters total of this dye stock. So what I wrote up here, I think instead I will take 40 milliliters of the 1% stock plus 120 milliliters of water and do it that way so I only have 160 milliliters. Then I wouldn't have, I don't need to mix up the other amount. And so this is going to be a lot easier to do, and therefore if there's a little bit of variability in that stock, the comparison between them will be consistent. Before we move on, we actually need to remove these minis from where we have them set up. And I'm going to do this with some zip ties. And we're going to make sure we come through, and we will pull them not super tight because we're going to want them to be pretty loose. But I am just going to pull these up, and this is going to be the way that we are going to keep them separate. I love these removable nylon zip ties. I do keep lists of all my favorite tools and equipment down in the video description, so I recommend you check that out. It feels a little silly having these zip ties on these tiny ones, but I think it will be fine. And so now what I'm going to do to help keep everything in order is as I take these off, I'm going to place all of these zip ties onto, whoop, and I can feel the tension differences now. I'm going to take all of these zip ties and sort of combine them with one, which will keep the zip ties in place a bit. And now we have all of our yarn ready to go and pre-soak, so that way we can dye it. But this will help keep things ordered as I make more sets. I am now going to go wind the other set of connected mini skeins that we talked about at the beginning off camera, and we'll come back and I'll show you the final results of my calculations. I don't feel like my wrapping went quite as well with this round. We definitely have like increasing sections this time, but I don't think I achieved a consistency that I feel like I had before. Don't forget that this time the goal was to have about 3/4 of the amount of yarn in each section going down, and we approximately got there. So then I went through and I did the same kind of calculations for the same type of colorway, having a 2% depth of shade on the smallest section and a 0.125% depth of shade on the biggest. And this time, since the relationship between the dyes and the weights of yarn aren't the same, we do have different volumes of dye that we will be using in each of the samples. Now, I was curious, and so I did go through and do the calculations again based on my target size for each of these minis, and the total amount of dye needed in both cases is actually really, really similar. I think the biggest difference in any of those cases was just 1 milliliter or 0.01 grams of dye. So that made me feel a little bit better about not getting the weights perfect. We will now go, I'm going to add zip ties to this just like I did to the previous one, and hopefully I'll be able to keep the two separate. One of them has one really, really tiny mini skein, so I think I'll be able to keep them apart, and we'll go and start setting up the actual dyeing project. My beaker already has 120 milliliters of water, and now I am going to measure out 40 milliliters of a 1% stock solution, there we go, of Jacquard Fire Red that I made about a month ago. So you can look and see that this is still very concentrated, but now that we have this that we can stir up, we can accurately add the same amount of dye into 5 mason jars. So in each of these, I am going to measure out 25 milliliters of our dye stock and add it into these jars. The jars are all different sizes today, since some of our minis are really small and some are really large. 50 grams in one of these small jars would be pretty compact. So yeah, I thought that that would work really well. I really like using graduated syringes that have the markings on them. It is a really easy way to measure. That and graduated cylinders are really handy, and I will link to the ones I use in the video description. We will end up with some leftover dye at the end of all of our projects today, so I imagine we'll have a bonus leave no dye behind skein. But now we've got our dye all measured. I added 1 cup of water to the small jars, 3 cups of water to the larger jars, and well, hopefully the yarn won't push this too much over the edge, but ultimately that little difference in volume doesn't make it look like a very different color. There is no acid in any of these containers yet. I did pre-soak all of the yarn in some plain tap water overnight, I suppose. And now I'm going to pick up our smallest one first and add it in slowly. You can see just how tiny that volume is. And then, okay, so that was the smallest. The next smallest, I do wish that maybe these connected minis weren't quite as long, because that is making it a little more challenging for me to kind of gather each of them. But I think it should be fine. And we will make sure to, I will make sure that as we go on, that we will sort of account for any of the areas that go in between. So here is our biggest one. Here is our second to biggest one. All right, and I think you can see that our lightest color is still fairly pigmented, but as we go through, even right now, you can get a sense in the difference in color intensity, which is pretty amazing given that as things stand, there's no acid, and so things aren't absorbing yet. Okay, now I want to make sure that all this yarn from these intermediate sections will get some color, sort of dipping it. Now some of these sections, especially in these lighter areas, might end up being fairly dilute. And what I'm realizing is that we may end up deciding that we want to shift our gradient more going forward and make it more extreme, rather than having each jar have a half of the depth of shade as the previous one. Maybe you would want to do it by a quarter, so that way the final color would be more pastel. So ultimately what we have here will be fairly subtle, but I think it'll be beautiful. Now that we're at this point, I'm actually going to add a half a cup of water to our 3 smallest jars, just so that way there is a bit more weight. Again, the total volume in each container is not really important. What is more going to be a lot more important is going to be the total amount of dye and absorbing that. And so now we want to add some acid. So I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of white vinegar to each of the 3 smaller jars, and then 2 teaspoons to the 2 larger jars. And we can always add more vinegar as needed. And then I will be stirring this up by mostly raising and lowering the yarn. This is a lot more important with the palest shades, just because there is so much yarn in here that if we want to have reasonable coverage and not make a big mess like I just demonstrated, we want to make sure it is well mixed. But I think that this is pretty fun. Okay, now we're going to need to heat everything. We did talk about the mid sections before, but I do want to make sure that those mids are dipped in with some of the acidic water, just because we want to make sure that the color on those areas will be set. And so that's just something to double check. Now I've got my pasta insert, and so we are going to carefully add these jars in to the pot. And then once the jars are inside, I'm going to be picking up the yarn that is in all these intermediate sections, because we're going to add this to a pot that is going to be filled with water, and we don't want any of that yarn to be dipping into the water bath, because if it does, then we could lose color in those sections. In my dedicated dye pot, I'm lowering this pasta insert. You can see that the water level is still very low in there, so I am going to very, very carefully increase the water level so it is about equal to the level of the lowest jars. You don't want any of the jars to float. Okay, now the water level is about right there, and we are going to start heating this up. Already, you can see that we do have a gradient. This color, which is our 2% depth of shade, is much, much deeper than our 1/4% depth of shade over here, even though there is still color intensity right here, which I think is beautiful and fun. So I'm gonna let this slowly heat up and we'll check in. It's a big pot, it'll take a while. We'll check in about 45 minutes. If the water was already hot, I would probably wait less time, but 45 minutes should be good. All right, the time is up. The heat is still on, and I did check in at one point. The color has pretty much absorbed from our two biggest minis that are the lightest, and I do definitely see a difference in hue. It is super subtle, but you absolutely see more of a difference as you get darker, and then the darkest is legit darker. But let's see, I see a tiny bit of color left in those three. So I am going to turn off the heat at this point, but I am going to add another teaspoon of vinegar. And actually, let's go ahead and just do 2 to each of the small ones. Yeah. We'll just add a lot more vinegar to each of them, and I'm going to put the cover back on, but I'll let things sit in here to have heat for a bit longer, and we'll check back in. One thing I love about mason jars and this whole technique is that you can just lift the pasta insert up out of the jar, but I would say it's still a little like it's hot. I just removed it, so it is not really cooled off yet, but most of the color has absorbed. Okay, so there's a tiny bit of color left in our deepest section right here. Okay, that is warm. Maybe the slightest hint of color. I'm actually thinking that I am ready to remove all of this to set it aside so that way we can play with our next colorway. But we will be resetting completely because I'm going to want to start with no vinegar again so we get slightly more even color coverage. But what I will do is grab our zip tie back so that way I can hold these together in the appropriate order as we move across, so that way we can try to keep things from getting tangled as best we can. And this method really does help, I've found, with our organization. And so I will draw that taut, pull out the yarn, and then here you can sort of start crudely to see a sense of our gradient here, which is heaviest on the pink, but it is fairly subtle going from the lightest to the darkest. But now we are going to let things cool completely so that way we can wash the yarn. The amount of yarn in between the different sections of our second gradient aren't as extreme, but there is a lot more of a difference in the total amount of dye we need for each of them, ranging from about 4 milliliters of our 1% stock solution to 22 milliliters. And so, just like last time, first I added the dye to each of the jars, and then I added some water, between 1 to 3 cups in each of the jars, so that way we could be ready to add the yarn. Once again, we have 3 cups of water in the 2 big jars and 1.5 cups in the smaller ones. And I am going to slowly and carefully take our yarn, starting with the skein that is going to have the deepest color. This time we definitely had a lot more dye go into this cup. Then we had on the previous one where we had the exact same amount of dye in each of the different containers. Oh dear. It probably would have been good for me to add some more ties on each of these, but you know, doing the best we can. All right. Now next up, yeah, the length of these is a little unwieldy. I would highly recommend doing this on, say, like a PVC pipe nitty knotty like I've done in the past when making some connected minis, versus doing this on the warping board. The warping board is good for so many things, but in this particular instance, the length of these I'm finding a little hard to manage. So that is just worth keeping in mind. Okay, let's actually go ahead and do the largest. But the nice thing is that I haven't had to question the order of any of them at any point, and so that is good. Okay. And the nice thing about working with a heavy worsted weight yarn is that we know at the end that there's not as much yardage to unravel, which is really handy. So right now I'm going ahead and adding color to these intermediate sections. Okay, so that is there. And now we need to add some vinegar. Once again, we're just going to start off a little slow. We will add a lot more acid as time goes on, but the concentration of all of these is about the same. I've got 1 teaspoon of white vinegar in each of the small containers, and then 2 in the larger one. And I'm just mixing this up a little bit, making sure that we get some acid over onto that intermediate area, because if we don't get acid on there, then we won't get color that will set. But by sort of lifting and touching, we are going to get that color, so I'm not really worried. And so the total gradient here should be the same as what we had last time. And by the same, what I mean is that we should have the same hues of the lightest color and the darkest color. The difference here is that we definitely used more dye because we've got more yarn in our 3 smallest jars. So now I'm going to pop these into that pasta insert and we'll go over to the stove. We're back at our pot, which is still fairly warm, and we are going to pop it in. So the difference this time is that this time the water bath already has some heat to it, but otherwise things are very similar. But yeah, you can already see our color difference there. All right, I'm going to cover this and let's wait 30 minutes to see how we've progressed. All right, the time is up, and I did just have to reduce the heat because it got pretty hot. Let's see. All right, I see a little bit of color left there. It looks like the lightest one has cleared. Obviously, I'm not reaching them up all the way, but I can see a little bit into the jars from where I am. Okay, I'm going to turn off the heat, but once again, we will be leaving the yarn in here a little while longer. I'm just going to add more vinegar to each of these jars. All right, and just to show you, let's see if I can pick this up. Yeah, you can see that there is still some color in there, but the additional heat and time should help nicely, and it will remain hot in here for a while. So maybe an hour or so is what I'll leave it, and then we'll come back. Let's see how we're doing. I just removed the yarn. from here. And oof, you can see the difference between the two palest. Oh, this is so cool. Darker, darker, darkest. Oh, that is awesome. Okay, let's see how this one is doing. And that is just about clear. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and remove all of this. Actually, I wanna get my other, oh, it's in the sink, I think. I want to get my zip tie so that way I can connect these together. Now there are still different sizes, but they are absolutely much more similar than the last one was. Honestly, it could be fun to do this fairly random as well, but now let me remove this. I need to get a pan. I love using these aluminum pans to just set yarn in. Makes life so much easier. But this time, oof, that is so pretty. There is, oof, here is our gradient. There's definitely a gradient. It is subtle. It is very, very subtle, but I think that actually subtle is pretty nice, but it's definitely weighted more on the light side. So we're gonna set this aside to cool now. I am dumping all of the water from these mason jars here into our pan, mainly to be a source of vinegar for a little bit of some leftover dye that we've got. This little bit extra that was mixed for that very, very first colorway. So not a lot of pigment. We've got a little bit more from cleaning out the syringes. And then I almost had aliquoted exactly the amount of color I needed, but I have a tiny bit left of some 1% color. And this is probably going to give us the bulk of the color that we have here. That other bit is not likely to have as big of an impact. Okay, I'm coming in with a skein of dry Knit Picks Hawthorne fingering weight yarn. This yarn is 80% superwash fine Highland wool, 20% polyamide. Ooh, and I think we're down to get a gorgeous, gorgeous pink, gorgeous medium pink. The yarn was dry, but you can see it just soaked up that liquid so fast. We've moved it around a bit, and now I'm going to turn the heat back on and heat it until the pot has cleared. Looks like after not very much time, the water has cleared mostly, and we've got this beautiful, beautiful pink. I'm going to turn off the heat. I'll go ahead and leave the yarn in here to cool, and also just have some more time with heat. That won't hurt anything. And yeah, when it's cool, then we can wash it along with the rest of our yarn. Okay, we've got all of our red yarn from our 200 grams of our gradients of attached minis, and then our leave no dye behind, which actually seems to be pretty close to that 0.25% depth of shade that we have going on, and there is no bleeding. That is fantastic. Let's add a little bit of dish soap. Well, the one problem with me picking reds for this project is that it is really hard to get reds to show up really true on camera. That is something that I have absolutely struggled with for a long time. So we will try our best, but yeah, that is no bleeding, and we do have beautiful, beautiful gradients here. All right, I am going to rinse out this soap, put all the yarn through my MiniSkeins spin dryer, and then hang everything up to dry so we can look at the dry yarn before I attempt to reassemble it into a more workable form. Here is our free-form faded striping pattern. The reason why I'm calling it faded is because when you unravel this, in some of these sections, and it's easy to see, like right here, how we'll have sections of green, a little bit of yellow, and more green. I'll insert a picture from Dyepot PS 25 so you can get a feeling for how my hand-painted stripes really knit up on a swatch and see that fade between them. But we do have a fractal pattern here, in that our blue, green, yellow repeat gets smaller and smaller, smaller and smaller, all the way down. Now at the end there is a little extra blue repeat, because if each time you use half the distance and half the distance, you'll never get all the way to the end. So I needed to end somewhere. Of all the colors, there was a tiny bit of transfer of the green onto this yellow stripe right here, just from the way that it was rolled up likely. This blank is a lot of fun, and you can see from the reverse side how much more pigmented the front is compared to the back. And this, not only are we going to have that organic fade feel, but there will be modeling and speckling in here, which you can already get a bit of a sense from where this started to unravel a little bit at the end. I am not planning to unravel this blank, because I think that by looking at it flat, even though I have it scrunched up right here, but by looking at it flat, you can get a better sense of that color progression. And so I think it would be really fun to knit with two socks at the same time. Since there are two strands, you will get a matched pair of socks, which means that this sort of free form kind of approach makes it so much more fun and unique. This project wasn't the focus of today's video, but I did really want to show some kind of more appropriate fractal type pattern before going into the asymmetric gradients, which again, I'm not really sure if it's appropriate for me to call them fractal gradients since there's not a repeating pattern, but I mean that sort of fit in my head. Before we go in closer, I want to say how much I love twill. I adore high twist yarn, and this one is no exception. It gives that wonderful glazed feel, depth in that colorway and the way it absorbs color, and I just wish that there was more yardage per 100 grams. That's the only thing that is a little bit of a bummer. But of course, for this project, I did pick it because the yardage was low, because it would make some things easier. And this project was a little more work intense or calculation intense compared to some other projects I've done. I am going to wind this onto a niddy-noddy shortly, but here is our first little gradient where we have just a tiny amount of the deepest color, and then each of the sections get bigger and bigger until you get to our lightest color at the end. This would be so pretty as a hat or something, starting with the darkest and working your way up, giving you a really gorgeous, gorgeous gradient. The gradient for our next colorway is very similar. Again, the smallest is the darkest, with each following section getting deeper and deeper as we go up. I think that overall this one feels a bit more balanced, even though the largest section is that palest color once again. Side by side, even before I wind these onto a niddy-noddy again, which I am going to do off camera pretty shortly, you can really see and feel that difference between them. The second set feels less asymmetric because it is. We started with a bigger section and had the difference between each of the sections was not as extreme as in our first one. And so whichever way you choose to create your gradient really probably depends on what you want to make with it and how big you want that difference to be. Now, it would also be really fun to do this instead of doing a gradient, to do this with more distinct, discrete colors, but for my first time trying this, I am really, really pleased with our results. Speaking of high twist, our hawthorn is gorgeous. I wish pinks showed up on camera better. The color that we have here is pretty close to the lightest color we have on both of our gradients. So I would say that this is around a 0.25% depth of shade, which for this red is still a fairly intense pink color. So there's a lot of pigment, and you could go with even less dye if you wanted to get a true baby pink. In both of these gradients, each section has half the depth of shade as the previous one. The numbers measuring out the dye end up being a little different, and the total amount of dye maybe doesn't follow that same logic, but when you're looking at the grams of dye per 100 grams of yarn, that's the way this progression happens. I am going to unwind this off camera. It's going to need a little finagling like some of the gradient yarn I've showed in the past, but I'm only going to remove the zip ties as I'm ready to work in each section, and I'm confident that I'm going to be able to do this pretty swiftly. Haha, swiftly, ha, okay. I'm going to go unravel. We have our softer gradient over on the right and the more extreme on the left. I have to say I definitely prefer the softer one. I think that the dark colors make a little more of an impact, but both of these could be really, really beautiful. The nice thing is that these gradients look so similar here on the Nitty Knotty as they did when I just still had the connected MiniSkeins, and so that is really helpful for getting a feeling of how things will look once you are ready to use it. And thankfully, these really weren't that hard to unravel. Maybe a few times I had to take one of the minis off and re-put it on the Swift, but overall things went really well. This definitely felt harder to me than doing connected MiniSkeins that were all the same size. But I would be willing to give this more of a shot in the future and potentially try something with more of a fractal striping pattern rather than having a smooth gradient if we had two different colors in there. And so then you could see that fractal repeating as they get smaller and smaller and smaller. I think that that would be something fun to do, although it would make sense to do that with more yardage. We had so little yardage here that some of the smallest sections were absolutely tiny. One big reason why I wanted to wind the MiniSkeins onto the Nitty Knotty is that it can be hard to tell if a yarn is a gradient just by looking at the skein. This is a gradient, and it almost looks like a bit of a tonal with a pop of red, which ultimately it is, but it's definitely a gradient yarn. You can tell the gradient a little bit more on the skein that has more balance, I guess. It isn't quite as extreme. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I really hope that this video was helpful. I know it was for me. I'm a little nervous to go through and edit all the math especially, but I am so happy with how all of this yarn turned out. And as I said, I'm open to exploring all of this more in the future. What other types of gradient techniques would you like to see me play with? Let me know down in the comments below. And of course, make sure that you're subscribed and you've pressed that bell to have your notifications on so YouTube can let you know whenever I release a new video. I always publish new content on Tuesday and Friday mornings, but I also have bonus content like this Dyepot PS series and other videos that come up that you really don't want to miss. And of course, if you want to support the channel on another level, go and check out the ChemKnits Patreon. You will find links to that, my Etsy shop, and all other kinds of places where you can find me down in the video description. I really, really, really like this red. Fire Red is an awesome, awesome red. I think, and this is a note to like past dialogues, when I'm using reds, I need to be a little careful with the proportions, because if you use too much then it becomes a lot more berry, but the red feels more true around, I would say maybe around the 1% or 0.5% depth of shade is sort of what it's looking like to me right here. I probably should have paid more attention to that when things were still wrapped up, but this is a reason to play with different depths of shades on MiniSkeins anyway, to get a sense of the color you want before going on and dyeing a big project. But anyway, I digress. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.